Welcome to Critical Issues, Alternative Views. I'm Ron Kramer, Professor of Sociology at Western Michigan University, and I'm the host for the program. Joining me today is one of our regular viewmeisters, Felix Brooks. Felix is back from an extended tour. You were what, Vietnam?
Vietnam, Washington,
Washington,
D.C.
D.C. Yeah. Off on assignment, as we say, so maybe Felix can clue us in a little bit about his travels when we get a chance. And joining us today is Allan Webb. Allan is a professor in the Department of English at Western Michigan University and a longtime friend, and also a member of the Climate Change Working Group at Western Michigan University. Allan's just written a book on helping teachers teach about climate change, and maybe he can talk a little bit about that later. But Allan, welcome to the program. It's great to have you on Critical Issues.
Nice to be here, Ron.
I'm surprised I haven't invited you to be on here before. So
well, I'm honored to be part of it.
It's great to have you. So this issue of climate change, I know that this is an issue that really you have taken on. This is a really a central issue for you. So I just want you to talk a little bit about how did you come to this particular issue? All of us sort of come to it, I think, in different ways, but how did you come to this issue and become so involved as you are right now?
Thanks, Ron. Well, I've been interested in social justice and political questions and issues for a very long time. Mm-hmm. I saw Al Gore's movie, Inconvenient Truth, years ago, and I thought, well, I bet he's right. I bet that's going to happen. But it went sort of in one ear and out the other in a way. I mean, from then on out, all right, climate change is an important issue. I checked that box. It's important. Then you and Paul Clements and Dave Crow started the faculty working group at Western. And just so happened that Paul sent me an email and invited me. And just so happened that the first meeting was next door to the building I was finishing a class in. I just finished. So I thought, well, I'll just go sit in on this meeting. He invited me over. And here were a whole group of mainly scientists who were really concerned. I mean, they were atmospheric chemists, they were soil scientists, they were biologists, and they were social scientists too. And I thought, I need to learn more. I need to sit down in this. I need to find out what's going on. So for the first couple years of that group, I attended almost every meeting. I listened to what you guys were all talking about. I became increasingly concerned. And then I started bringing it into my own teaching. And I taught a class about climate change and culture, and then I taught environmental studies. And then I realized this was something that we needed to all be concerned about, and that I do a lot of work with teachers. And so I thought, I need to share with them what I'm learning, and I need to write for them about how to address climate change, not just as a science topic, but it's a topic that addresses almost every dimension of life, and particularly it addresses issues of inequality, who suffers from climate change, who causes climate change. It is about the historical past, how we came to the moment we're in. It's about imagining where we're going to go next in the future. And for English students, it's a lot about how to write about it, how to take action on it, also how to read about possible futures, climate fiction, climate film, how to think critically about them and how they help us understand the present. And I have to say that all the work I then went on, reading on my own, took me to a whole nother level, I think, beyond where I was with the working group. With the working group, I was getting a sense of the science. I was getting a sense of beginning to inform people in our community. But I have now become very seriously concerned. In fact, people say alarmed. I think I'm past alarmed. I'm just plain frightened about climate change. Mm-hmm. And I want to just say just a moment about why I've become so frightened. Okay. Partly, I think we're at a moment, I'll just refer to a couple of recent facts. We're at a moment where something is changing with climate change. People don't understand how quickly climate change has happened. They talk about pre-industrial temperatures, which they think about, maybe hundreds of years ago or something like that. Mm-hmm. Actually, the world's temperature has not changed very much since about this. It started really changing in the 70s, mainly because of much greater production of greenhouse gases in the 1950s. There was an acceleration in the 1950s. That's what really started making a difference. And so the climate temperatures, people began to really notice in the 70s. Mm-hmm. But if you think about like the late 70s to the present, that's not very long ago, and yet we've the global temperature has increased perhaps 1.25 degrees since that time. The climate scientists, experts that I've been reading who are trying to figure out what's going to happen next have said to us that the difference between 2 degrees and 4 degrees of global warming is human civilization.
Yeah.
And we're now at 1.25 degrees centigrade. So, in the last 2014 was the hottest year ever recorded in the temperature record, and in the thermometer record. And 2015 was substantially hotter than that.
Right.
And 2016 was substantially hotter than that. In fact, 2016 was 0.2 degrees centigrade hotter than 2015. Now, 0.2 degrees centigrade in 1 year. And if we're talking about human civilization at 2 degrees of temperature change, we're talking about something of enormous seriousness that's happening much faster. Human beings are releasing CO2 faster than it's ever been released. It's on what's called a hockey stick graph. It's going up like that, sharper and sharper. Temperature follows. So I read, about how Arctic ice is now far less than it's ever been before. And I also read just recently that in Africa, all the warning signs have gone off, that there's going to be a famine facing 20 million people.
Right now in the South Sudan, it's just, I don't know if you saw any reports yesterday, it's just incredible misery going on in South Sudan. They're only able to bring in supplies through the air because of the civil war. The convoys get attacked, but just a desperate situation.
It's in 4 different countries.
And of course, aggravated by climate change. This is
substantial. It's really the ability to address the problem is problematic because of the wars, but the climate change is what's causing the problem. And the New York Times article that just came out yesterday, day before yesterday, said that not only was it 20 million people facing a famine, but that they listed off the countries in which there were severe food shortages. Those countries have 200 million more in population. They said that this famine is the largest humanitarian crisis since World War II. What's happening, Ron, I believe right now is the end of the beginning. By that I mean that climate change in this short span of time has really begun. It's taken a grab on what's happening to the planet Earth, to the oceans, to the drought, to the sea level rise, to the temperatures and storms and everything else. But this massive, massive famine is the sign that we're moving into the next phase. And the next phase is going to be very deadly all over the world.
And I think one of the problems with climate change and getting people to pay attention and understand is that when people think about it, it's always way off in the future. Like the effects are going to, okay, but that's.
They believe it, but they don't believe it's going to impact them personally.
I guess so. I guess it's not going to impact them, or that, I think we discount threats that are so far off on the horizon. We're more attuned, I think, just because of our backgrounds to biology to respond to the immediate threat, right? That's in front of us, but the distant threats we tend to sort of discount, or we can intellectually understand them, but emotionally we don't seem to be as involved with them.
But we're noticing a change in the way people understand climate change. People, Americans, even Americans who are the least cognizant of climate change, I think, of almost anyone on Earth, have become more and more willing to recognize that it's happening, despite, we'll talk in a minute, I know, about the current politics about climate change, but they're recognizing it partly because they're seeing things that are different. They're seeing, 70-degree days near Christmas around here. We had in Kalamazoo, our little town, we had a week there in February where the temperatures were all above 60 degrees. At the same time, the Kalamazoo Public Schools shut down because of a viral epidemic. And our little girl went to the doctor, and the doctor said, well, the reason why the viral epidemic is happening is because viruses have a very hard time when it's really cold, but it's a lot warmer. So what we experienced in Kalamazoo was a climate change disease epidemic in Kalamazoo that shut the schools down. People didn't connect the dots,
Right.
but that's what's happening. And they noticed this. They noticed that the storms are greater. The very, very cold snaps that we've had have been part of climate change as the Arctic winds are changed by the massive heating in the Arctic. So,
well, let's transition to the politics. I think you're right that more people are beginning to recognize, certainly the public opinion polls are showing that more people are becoming concerned about this issue. We know that the international political community has long been concerned about this. We have the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that goes back to 1988, and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which dates back to Rio in 1992, and ever since then the United Nations has been meeting on a yearly basis to try to come up with some kind of an agreement among the international community. Over that long stretch of time, there have been some progress, but not as much as people wanted to see happen or needed to happen. And part of what has been happening is that the United States has been not as forthright in participating in this process. So even when we came up with the Kyoto Agreement in '97, the George W. Bush administration withdrew from that, and so the United States didn't participate. Finally, under President Obama, we began to see a little bit more concern at the national level about
later
this
on in
issue.
his term, is exactly right.
Especially later in his term. And so finally then we did get an international agreement in Paris in 2015. And so, you know, again, think the UN's been meeting on this every year since 1992. It took us to 2015 to get an agreement that had a little bit of oomph to it, right? And even then, you and I know that the Paris Agreement is not exactly where we need to be. Even with the Paris Agreement, we're still going to fall far short. We need to do even more than what Paris does. But just for the moment, to let people know, at Paris, the nations of the world agreed that each country would develop what are called independent, nationally determined contributions, intended nationally determined contributions. So each nation basically sets an agreement. Now, it's still voluntary, which is a big weakness of this. But so the U.S. part of this is that we pledge that we're going to reduce our emissions a 25% reduction over our 2005 level of emissions by 2025. That's what we pledged to do. Now, at the time, it wasn't formalized as a treaty because the Obama administration knew that a treaty would have to be ratified by the United States Senate. What do you think the chances are that the U.S. Senate was going to ratify this?
Slim and none. And he knew that.
Yeah.
You know, it was more symbolic in a lot of ways to at least show the rest of the world that we're willing to take some steps towards trying to mitigate this process. So, but he knew he was going to be up against it in the Congress because you had all these pro-growth hawks who, you know, think that, you know, that the trade-off is jobs for a cleaner environment, and it's just not that binary. But that's what they've tried to sell all these years.
And the Republican Party, clearly controlling both houses of Congress and particularly the Senate, and the Republican Party is just an outlier at this point. Actually, it's the only ideologically conservative party in the world that still actively denies climate change.
Well, it's really clear why. I mean, in order to meet the Paris Agreement, which is absolutely essential, 80% of the known carbon reserves have to stay in the ground. They cannot come out of the ground. And the largest corporations on Earth, which are the oil companies, own these resources. They count them on their books. If you take those resources away from them, it'll be trillions and trillions of dollars that will dramatically reduce their wealth. And so they are doing everything they can to make sure that the congressmen that they employ by their contributions, you know, to their campaigns, are protecting their wealth. And alas, our congressman here, Congressman Upton, has been receiving that kind of payment himself. So, and voting just the way they want him to vote. So it's the rest of the earth, and not only all human beings, frankly, it's all nature too. I mean, the idea that we're going to devastate all these species, that we're going to devastate the oceans and the natural world, I find very troubling and offensive. Not to mention, of course, like I said at the very beginning, 20 million people in suffering famine today. And that's just the beginning.
You know, so you have these anti-climate, you know, the climate deniers coming from two different schools. One we know that Allan explained, which is the pure profit motive. But then the Trumpian folks, who I refer to them as, are these anti-science, anti-intellectuals. They don't know anything about, you know, they don't really care about the profit margin as much as they're anti-intellectual. They don't believe in the science. At least that's the narrative that they put out there. And that's what he put out there to sell to his, you know, those forgotten classes of people that he wants to put back to work. That's all just a hoax. You know, and that seemed to be a viable narrative because it's a simple solution to a more complex problem. But he's been able to sell it that way.
So that brings us to the issue at hand today, I think, is to talk about the new political era that we're in. And so already, I would have argued that we were in desperate straits, right?
Yeah.
Even with President Obama, even with the Paris Agreement, that we're still in a desperate situation. So much more still needs to be done if we're going to avert the worst consequences of climate change in the future. And of course, some of this is already well underway, as you just documented. But now we have a new president and a new administration, and we have people who are active climate deniers in the president himself and in many key cabinet positions. So, for example, the director of the Environmental Protection Agency is Scott Pruitt, the former Attorney General of the state of Oklahoma. He has spent his whole career fighting against the EPA, filing lawsuit after lawsuit against the EPA.
And in direct collusion with the very companies that, you know, that
He's
that
supposed to
Allan
regulate.
They're supposed to regulate, all the while he was in office.
Yes, which the email trail that was uncovered and was forced out reveals that he certainly was in bed with the fossil fuel industry and doing their bidding as Attorney General. But now he's the director of the Environmental Protection Agency. And of course, Rex Tillerson, the former CEO of ExxonMobil, is now our Secretary of State. And we could go on and on and on and list other key cabinet positions which are now occupied by people who, if not outright climate deniers, at least are people who are not inclined to do anything about the issue.
Or don't know the names of the agencies that they work for, like, you know,
Well, that could
Rick
well
Perry,
be too.
you know, the Department of Energy. So
And so we're beginning to see out of the Trump administration a very concerted pattern of basically attacking climate science, attacking any effort to deal
Science in
with
general,
climate change,
you know.
attacking science in general. And so one of the things that happened is President Trump submitted his budget, which is hopefully dead on arrival in the Congress, but still it called for a 31% budget cut for the Environmental Protection Agency, $2.4 billion being cut out of the EPA budget. We also know that when Trump was in Detroit a couple of weeks ago, he was talking to the automobile companies and said, hey, I'm going to give you regulatory relief from those CAFE standards, those corporate average fuel efficiency standards. So basically, as part of the deal, when Obama helped to bring the automobile industry back, they agreed to increase the fuel efficiency of their fleet. And now Trump is basically saying, forget about that. I'm going to undo all of that so you won't have to meet those standards, which means, of course, greater emissions. The Trump administration has approved the Keystone XL pipeline, which Obama had finally made a decision against. And so now this notion that we're going to complete this pipeline, which is going to carry the oil sands, the
Tar sands.
the tar sands, the
Which
oil
is the
sands,
worst kind of
the worst fossil
most
fuel
polluting
coming
fossil
up.
fuel. Yeah.
And that's going to be shipped down to Texas and refined and then marketed overseas, but it's going to contribute enormously to emissions. So all of this is already happening. And then last week, we finally get the executive order. And if you go back to the Paris Agreement that I talked about earlier, remember that we pledged that we're going to reduce our emissions 25% over the 2005 levels by 2025. How are we going to do that? Well, the CAFE standards were a part of it, but the biggest part of it was something called the Clean Power Plan.
Yeah.
So, Alan, do you know about the Clean Power Plan? What was involved with that?
Well, I know that it was going to create new standards for how much pollution the plants could create, and the standards meant that many of the coal power plants were going to have to be decommissioned.
Yes.
They wouldn't be able to build new ones, and the Clean Power Plan was at the center of Obama's plan to try to meet the Paris Agreement.
Exactly.
And to torpedo that Clean Power Plan is absolutely devastating to that plan, to the Paris Agreement. And, the consequences are really multiple. I mean, one of the things that you and we all chatted about momentarily before was this is the most foolhardy way to try to think about addressing employment, if that's all you cared about.
Yeah.
I mean, to have our companies make cars that are not environmentally as efficient as they can be, to have our industry developing coal rather than solar and wind, which are renewable and which these are clearly the energy sources and the transportation sources of the future. That's what China and other countries that are serious about their own economies are investing in. And the idea that our country would cut out from under the feet of our industry the capacity to build economic growth and provide jobs in the name of protecting the money, protecting the wealth of the people that own the oil, which is what they're doing. Felix talks about thumbing the nose of the science. I think that's just a bunch of show. I think they're thumbing the nose of the science because they are really protecting that wealth. And that is devastating to the working people in this country, simply from the point of view of employment. And you know, and you can tell that I am very concerned about the cost to the people of this country of what climate change is going to do, the cost to the people of this world of what climate change is going to do. So that's really the most important question, but the shorter term question of employment and economic development, this is frankly, this is stupid. It's regressive, and it's not going to be successful, and it's very unfortunate.
When Trump signed the executive order the other day, he surrounded himself with coal miners from West Virginia. And when he got done signing it, Felix, did you notice how he looked up to one coal miner and said, "You know what this means?
Yeah.
This means you're going back to work." Does it really mean he's going back to work?
Not really. I mean, I said this to some of my friends. I said, it'll be interesting to see 3 and 4 years from now what those guys who were standing up there are actually doing, because I don't think they're going to be mining coal. Because the fact of the matter is that automation and natural gas have done far more to put coal miners out of work than anything that has to do with any clean air standards. And that's just a fact of life. Those jobs have been going for the last 25 years.
Yeah, and the CEO of Murray Coal Company came right out and said, "I tried to tell Trump not to overpromise here," because he said it's not really the regulations that have caused the decline in jobs in our industry. It's exactly what you say. It's the mechanization of how we extract coal, and it's the competition that we're experiencing on the market from cheaper natural gas.
I mean, think about this. There's a commercial that they show on TV now that shows a modern Honda plant. And I can remember, because I've had uncles and aunts who worked in factories, and the first thing you notice in that commercial is there are very few people on the shop floor, which is what happened with GM, Ford, and Chrysler. You go into one of those plants today in 2017 and think about what it looked like in 1975, where there were infinitely more people, and you have a recipe of what's happening in the coal industry, the same thing. Automation comes in. There's no turning that back. Technology is not going to go away. And if I can create a situation where I've got to pay less people, that means less salary, that means less retirement, that means less health care insurance, that's what I'm going to do as a person who owns a company and looking for their own interest or the shareholders' interest. So those jobs are not going to come back. They're going to be gone permanently.
Yeah, and so relaxing or killing the Clean Power Plan is not going to put coal miners back to work. And in fact, it's going to only allow for greater profits for the coal industry for perhaps a couple of years.
Short term, very short term. At the cost of the planet Earth, at the cost of what may be human civilization. And that sounds like I'm a fanatic, but it's not fanatic. I can recommend a book to people called 6 Degrees. Our life on a hotter planet goes step by step into where the future will take us based on the best modern science. And there was a lot that he's done too, besides the CAFE standards and the Clean Power Plan. He's reduced regulation of methane. He's taken away the regulation of energy efficient appliances that are in everyone's home. He's opened up public lands to coal development. He has taken a stand against putting any kind of price on the cost of carbon. What's really going to be interesting here, well, I don't think it's even going to be interesting because I know what's going to happen, but Pruitt, in his tenure at Oklahoma, spent all his time arguing for states' rights, that the government has no right to tell states how to regulate its use of fossil fuels.
Fracking.
Yeah, like fracking, for example,
Yeah.
which is of course ridiculous, because the main point about air standards is the Oklahoma air does actually move into other places, and Oklahoma's air comes from other places. We can't, we have to regulate these things and not stopping at state borders.
And for that matter, in Oklahoma now, because of all the fracking that's going on, they have more seismic activity going on there than we do in California, which is a direct result of drilling all these wells.
And those produce all kinds of leaks of greenhouse gases, which are very hazardous.
Methane in particular.
In particular, methane, which
Yeah.
is far more dangerous than CO2. I've read anywhere between 20 to 100 times more, depending on how you measure how long it's in the air. But the point I was going to get to is the places that are now trying to regulate their greenhouse gases are California and New York and other liberal states. And what we're going to see is the federal government going after those states to try to stop them from doing that. And even Scott Pruitt, who's made his career using, frankly, the phony argument of states' rights. It was the exact same argument that was used to stop racial integration in the schools. It was the exact same argument that was used to stop equal rights for gay, lesbian people. It's a phony argument. They use it, but, and we'll see how phony it is when they go after California and New York.
I mean, there's a classic episode which lets you know how long people have been thinking about the effects of climate change. I remember a classic episode of Star Trek, the original Star Trek, where they were on the
Felix,
planet.
you're older than you
Yeah,
look. I just
know.
want to point that out.
I know. where people could not be outside during the daytime. Everybody had to be inside the buildings because the planet had been degraded so much by human activity that it was too hot to be outside. So all human activity had to take place inside. So that's sort of what you're talking about here, that doomsday scenario that we're headed for if we continue to let this planet heat up. It'll be so hot that it'll be impossible for folks to be outside, particularly in certain regions of the country. It'll just be too hot. You can't be outside. It'll be dangerous.
And not enough water. The aquifers where water is stored underground, they are tens of thousands of years old. That's ancient water, and it doesn't get replenished. So it's being
if you
sucked
think we got
out.
a migration crisis now, think about what that will look like when there'll be places on the planet where people can't stay anymore. They'll have to move to other places. And you see some of that going on even now.
Well, seriously, Mexico City has got a terrible water crisis. And we're talking about building this wall. I had a sentence from this book. Can I read a sentence
Sure.
on your program? Is that
Sure.
not very lively?
So this book is a book called Tropic of Chaos. It's written by Christian Parente, who's a sociologist who mostly works as a journalist for The Nation magazine. And this book, Parente traveled around the world in the tropics, basically documenting on the ground the impact of climate change occurring right now. And this book's several years old already, so yeah.
Yeah, well, he says at one point something that really struck me, thinking about what you were just talking about, migration, and even Trump's idea of building the wall to keep the Mexicans and Central Americans out of our country and so forth. If climate change is allowed to destroy whole economies and nations, no amount of walls, guns, barbed wire, armed aerial drones, or permanently deployed mercenaries will be able to save one half of the planet from the other. That's the future we're going into. Unless we decide we're going to, as a human species, we're going to change our behavior, and we're going to put aside and these people whose short-term wealth is so important to them that they can't see what's happening, and we're going to work together collaboratively to address climate change. And it's got to be through the Paris Agreement is the road. It's the only road. And we as a country have to support that.
Parente uses a phrase in there, the politics of the armed lifeboat.
Yeah.
And so, again, I think that's a very apt phrase. The global south is being affected most dramatically, first of all, by climate change. The whole world's being affected, but in the global south, the effects are much greater. And of course, they've had the least to do with creating the problem. And so if we're getting these kind of, the droughts and the famines and heat waves, and then again, this is leading to the resource wars that we're seeing in the tropics, and this is the migration that's occurring.
The Sahara is expanding in both directions, and it's predicted at 3 degrees centigrade, the Sahara will be halfway into France.
Wow.
So that the Mediterranean Sea, the whole region around the Mediterranean, which is densely populated on all sides, is going to have to be abandoned. We're talking about migration.
Yeah, we're talking about migration. People will have to go, and they will go. And as you said before, those walls aren't going to stop them. It's not going to happen.
And this is why the Pentagon, the military, does see climate change as an enormous problem. It may be that there are a lot of people in the government that are deniers and working to undo any effort to deal with climate change, but the military sees this as a critical problem.
Well, the
and
military is not.
they're working on it. Unfortunately,
Yeah.
they're working on it more in the realm of the politics of the armed lifeboat. How can we use the military to keep those people from coming and migrating?
If you listen to the news this morning, NPR, they ran a story on climate change, and they were interviewing a former Secretary of the Navy. And he was talking about it from a practical human standpoint with regard to sea level on the eastern coast. And how he says, I'm here for, I've witnessed this over the last 20 years, and we've watched the rise of sea level and the impact that it's had on, on cities and towns all up and down the East Coast, particularly in the areas around, Virginia and Washington, D.C. And he said it's going to make a tremendous impact. And for us to back out of this now, he said that's not going to happen without consequences, without there being serious consequences for folks down the road.
Yeah, and it's just amazing to me that the people who are in charge of our government right now cannot see the ominous implications of all this and are basically taking this path, which is only going to aggravate climate change. After Trump came up with his executive order the other day, which does all these things, tries to kill the Clean Power Plan, ends the moratorium on coal leases on federal land, as you mentioned, and allows for greater release of methane, ignores the cost of carbon policy. So it's just a tremendously bad executive order. And just some of the comments and global anger and dismay was the headline in one newspaper. Sheer reckless folly was another headline. The dangerous and biggest con was the headline in Rolling Stone. An international embarrassment, Bernie Sanders called it. Deeply dismaying was the New York Times editorial. And here's one I thought was the best, and this comes from my not a personal friend, but one of my favorite writers, Tom Engelhardt, who's the editor of TomDispatch.com. He said, in the end, if a Trump presidency takes this country out of the climate change sweepstakes entirely, if it opens the flood and fracking gates yet wider on the development of fossil fuels of every sort while tamping down the development of alternative energy sources, you're talking about an act of terror on a scale that would have once been inconceivable. Mm-hmm. Those are the consequences that we're facing, and yet this administration, so many people use the terminology of crime, that this is a climate crime, that these are carbon criminals. And I think, people resort to that concept because it seems to be the concept that best symbolically conveys their concern about these actions that are being taken.
Terror and mass death.
Yeah.
Mass death, and when we've got 20 million people in famine right now because of drought, which is climate change.
But in the world that he operates in, and we now know this, the only information that's coming into him is news via Fox and Breitbart. That's the bubble that he operates from. And the New York Times did a fascinating piece last week where they spent 18 hours covering Fox News. And what you find out when you listen to that, read that piece is, these stories, they don't even talk about them. So the echo chamber that he's getting this information from, they don't talk about this stuff. He doesn't hear this stuff, and we know, because he admitted himself, the man doesn't read anything, doesn't read books, doesn't read newspapers. So if his world is the world of Fox and Breitbart, is he going to hear about any of this climate stuff? Is anybody going to come to him and talk to him about it with an alternative narrative? No, because he doesn't want those people in the room. They're not going to be there. And that's what makes this doubly dangerous, is that there's no information that's going to come into that White House that's going to be of a contrary nature to move him off the path that he's on with respect to this stuff. It's not going to happen.
It's profoundly irresponsible. Yeah. If the task of a leader, particularly the President of the United States, is to be responsible for the health and welfare of the United States, not to mention the rest of the world, it's profoundly irresponsible. In fact, I think it's a crime. I agree with you. I agree with that analysis. And I'm concerned about my family members who get their news from Fox News also. But I think the other news media, frankly, have not adequately portrayed what's happening with climate change either. This famine is not getting enough attention. If it's the largest humanitarian crisis since World War II, it should be very much on the front of the news. And so should climate change in general. I read a study that showed that since 2008, the climate change has gone down and down as a topic on television news programs, for example. I'm afraid our news is also in some measure connected to the corporate system that is supporting the oil companies and that wealth. I think we need to have look to alternative news sources, such as this program, and other sources to really find out what is happening, and to take the enormous to be a citizen in any country is a responsibility.
Yeah.
But if you're an American citizen, a citizen in the most militarily powerful and economically powerful country on earth that's taking this wrong direction, you have a very big responsibility to speak out and to get involved. This country is responsible for 27% of all the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Everybody says now China produces more than the United States does on a per year basis. That's true. On a per capita basis, far less than we produce. And historically, it's been the American industry and greenhouse gases that have created this single greatest problem in terms of.
And even the Chinese now, in light of Trump's, executive order, basically said, you know what, we're moving full steam ahead. We know this is a problem for our folks. We understand this. And if the United States is not going to take the lead on it, we'll be more than happy to take the lead, whatever the consequences are that come from that. But they recognize that.
Yeah, and here's the issue for me. I mean, moving in the direction of renewable energy, clean energy and sustainability and energy efficiency, moving in that direction could be enormously beneficial economically for the United States. I mean, Trump kept talking about jobs, jobs, jobs during the campaign. He's not going to bring back those coal jobs, but clearly there's lots of jobs to be created if we were to move more strongly in the direction. Already, clean jobs, clean energy jobs outnumber the jobs in the fossil fuel industry, sometimes by 2 to 1, depending on which.
Take a look at those pipelines. It takes, maybe quite a few workers to build a pipeline. Once it's built, they're done.
Yeah.
It takes almost no workers to run
The Keystone XL will produce 35 permanent jobs. 35, that's all.
And at what environmental cost?
At what price?
Yeah.
Again, it's that short-term thinking, though, that seems to drive these individuals. They're not thinking about the big picture.
Yeah. Solar, wind, they grew 12 times as fast as jobs in the rest of the U.S. economy over the last decade.
I mean, take for example our college. We have a wind turbine academy. So we teach students how to build and maintain wind turbines. Every year that we graduate a group of students who go through this 26-week program, they're out the door. That's how quickly they can find jobs.
With good salaries, too.
With really good salaries.
And by the way, they're not down in a coal mine, for God's sake.
No, not at all.
I mean, they're outside working with the wind. I mean.
And it's a skill that almost anybody can learn because it's a 24-week, 22 to 24-week program. So you're giving up less than a year of your time in order to acquire the skill. And when they're interviewing some of the coal miners, and I can understand where they're coming from, when they were talking to some of these folks about training for other jobs, all they wanted to do is what they were doing, and I get that. If this is all that's gone on for the last 25 generations, or however you want to call it, this is all you want to do. Well, as people found out in Pontiac, where I grew up at General Motors, once those jobs start leaving, then you're forced to look at alternatives.
Yeah.
Because they're not going to employ. When I was in Pontiac in the mid '70s, you were talking about maybe 14 factories in and around the city of Pontiac. Well, those numbers are way down now. Yeah. They don't employ anywhere near as many people because they don't need to, because automation has made a complete conversion of the auto industry now, and they don't need as many people working on the factory floors. Yeah. And that's going to be the future the same way with coal. Despite what Trump says, that's not going to stop. That march is not going to stop.
What you're saying to me, Felix, is that Michigan's got something to teach the rest of the country. We've got a lesson here about the impact of changing industries and how to deal with it. And we need to make, we got to not follow the West Virginia model. We're trying to continue to develop coal. We've got to go on the Michigan model of trying to figure out how do you make a better economy when the economic system, industrial system is in transformation.
So the economic arguments, I think, for moving ahead and dealing with climate change are extremely strong, and hopefully could be used to sway some people. I mean, to me, the moral arguments are tremendously important, and to me, this is an issue of intergenerational justice, right? I mean, you have several small daughters, younger daughters. I have 2 grandchildren. You have grandchildren. To me, this is an issue where our generation is leaving a terrible legacy for the generations to come. And so to me, one of the reasons I work so hard on this issue is because of my grandchildren. And I want to do whatever I can to deal with climate change for their sake. And so there's a broader moral issue of intergenerational justice, I think, that needs to be addressed here.
You know, Ron, I want to look in the face any person who's over 40 years old and who is denying the reality of climate change and the importance of addressing it. And I want to say to that person, do you understand what you're doing to all the young people who are now alive in this country and who will come into this country? A child born today can be expected to live to 2100. We may be looking at a devastated world in 2100. I think the older people in this country need to rethink very carefully what they're doing. We know from the research that younger people are much more willing to accept the facts on climate change than older people. And I think older people in my generation need to wake up and face reality and think very carefully about the consequences for their loved ones.
Because they're very real in terms of the long term and the impact that it's going to have.
So the Trump assault on the climate here, and we've already documented a number of ways in which this is occurring: cutting the EPA, trying to reduce the CAFE standards, approving the Keystone XL, now this executive order that's going to try to gut the Clean Power Plan. This assault that's underway is generating tremendous resistance. And we've already seen that other Trump administration policies, like the Muslim travel ban and the attempt to repeal Obamacare, that those were massively resisted, and that we can utilize the courts, we get people in the street, we get political pressure, and at least with regard to the Muslim ban and the repeal of Obamacare, some significant victories have been won. I think we need to have galvanized the resistance to this assault on the climate in just the same way.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
It's not happening as dramatically, perhaps, as the protests concerning those other things, but there are things that are going to be occurring. And so there's a lot that's going on here in ways in which there can be resistance. Already, there have been several lawsuits filed to try to block the Keystone XL pipeline. And on the West Coast, there's a very important federal lawsuit that's been initiated by 21 young people. Mm-hmm. And they are basically, so it's been titled the Children's Climate Case. And they've gone into federal court, and they basically are suing the federal government, and they're saying that the federal government has failed to do anything about climate change, and climate change is already affecting their future. It's already damaging them, that they have legal standing because climate change is creating harm for them in a variety of ways. Therefore, their lawsuit says that the federal government has to protect them and has to come up with a plan to more forthrightly deal with climate change. Now, this lawsuit has passed the beginning stages. So they've been granted legal standing in the effort to quash it. The federal district judge out there basically said that she ruled that she thinks that they have a good chance to win their case, and so she's going to allow it to go to trial. So that's the first significant hurdle. So now, later this year, there will be a trial out in federal district court in Oregon concerning the Climate Kids case, and so that'll be an interesting thing to follow. So just as the courts were used to block the Muslim ban, and we had mounted political resistance in Congress to block the Obamacare repeal, I think these kinds of things have to be happening with regard to the climate all around. And so we might mention that people do have an opportunity to participate in a number of events of political resistance. One is that on April 29th in Washington, D.C., there will be a massive climate mobilization. And so if you get a chance to go to
there will be buses from Kalamazoo.
There are going to be buses from Kalamazoo. So if you want to go, basically, I hope there's a way for you to get there. And
we'll have a local climate march here too.
There'll be a local
right?
march. Yeah. Even if you can't go to D.C., you can still march that day and express your concern about the climate. And so a lot of that has been happening. And so again, we just need to kind of keep that kind of pressure on. Now, Allan, I know that there's also another big event coming up. April 22nd is Earth Day. And so I know that you have been very actively involved in creating an Earth Day event here in Kalamazoo. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that? I thought we'd do this a little more toward the end of the program. We're getting close to the end, but we have a little bit more time. So why don't you talk a little bit more about
I'd love to
Earth Day?
talk about Earth Day. You know, what an important day Earth Day is. You think about that beautiful planet that we have out in space, blue and full of life, and it's critical that we protect and celebrate that beautiful planet in the face of climate change, in the face of other assaults. What's going to be terrific in Kalamazoo is we're going to have there will be an Earth Day event in the morning, a run and activities at the Nature Center. That's been going on for a number of years, but this year, for the first time in many years, Bronson Park is going to be a center for Earth Day. So starting at 3 o'clock in the afternoon till 8 o'clock in the evening, there's going to be a big celebration and also a political event kind of mixed together in Bronson Park from 3 till 8. We'll have music, we'll have speakers in the band shell, we'll have all kinds of family and children activities, we'll have booths of companies that are doing things to support the climate, nonprofit and environmental groups will be there as well, seeking people that would like to find out what they're doing and get involved with them. We hope to have some of the car companies have their electrical and hybrid cars available for people to take a look at. So it's going to be, there'll be food, it's going to be a lot of fun. We'll have a speaker at 6 o'clock that you've heard before.
Peter Sinclair.
Peter Sinclair,
Yeah,
exactly. And I think that will be a fun event. The Science March that's happening that same day is going to start at Western, I believe, at 1 and go and end up at the Bronson Park as we are in the midst of the Earth Day celebrations.
And we should point out that this is a sister march to a march that's going to be occurring in Washington, D.C.
Right, of course. Another
So on April 22nd, on Earth Day in Washington, D.C., there's going to be a march by scientists.
Yeah.
So again, imagine what it takes to get scientists to come out of the lab, basically, and get political and say, we're being forced by this administration to get in the streets and protest and demonstrate and resist because of the anti-science attitude of this administration.
I mean, it's sort of like Galileo or something. It's something like, the Middle
it has
Ages.
that feel.
I mean, what on earth do we can't pay attention to science?
Yeah,
I find it ridiculous and troubling.
So scientists are marching in D.C., and as you say, we'll have a sister march here that's in connection with
It's going
your
to tie
Earth
right
Day event.
into Earth Day. We're going to have some extra events at Earth Day that are going to be really neat. Everybody knows that lives in Kalamazoo that we have this Christmas time. They put up these candy canes, along the rows.
Candy Cane Lane.
Candy Cane Lane
Yeah.
in Bronson Park. We've got permission from the city to use the post holes that are in the ground every 10 feet or so along those diagonal walkways in Bronson Park. In fact, if you're standing facing the band shell, the walkway on your right is going to be what we're going to call the Walk into the Climate Future. And it's going to have 8-foot tall pipes that are installed with a framework on it and beautiful art that's going to go from about 4 feet high along that walkway on both sides. So it'll be immersive, and it will let you walk from pre-industrial temperatures, 0 degrees, we'll call it, to a 1 degree warmer, which is about where we are now. We're a little hotter than that. To where we'll be at 2 degrees, where we'll be at 3 degrees, and it'll be a little. Each section will have a sentence and then a longer paragraph. You can get some more specifics about it. We'll have handouts and a table there of information to talk about what is coming up in the climate future. I mentioned the Sahara being in France at 3 degrees. The IPCC has talked about 6 degrees being possible with it before 2100, and they've actually usually been too conservative. So what will happen at 6 degrees? And I could talk about that if you want to. It's very scary. But the other diagonal is going to be about maintaining the Paris Agreement. And what maintaining the Paris Agreement, trying to keep the Earth at 2 degrees, means the reversal of the policies that President Trump is putting in place right now. And so obviously we'll have to deal with the politics of that. It also means things that individuals can do in their own lives to reduce their carbon footprint and to become part of a social movement to keep the Paris Agreement in effect. So there's going to be, in a sense, this vision of where we're headed and this set of possibilities for how to make sure that the worst consequences of that vision are not going to be realized. So that will be a centerpiece of the Earth Day celebration in the park. we'll have a bunch of kids' activities. One thing is we may have, like, you remember the game musical chairs, where you put the music on and the chairs disappear. We're brainstorming ideas. One idea we came up with was give the kids some seal and polar bear masks, and then put the music on, and then have sheets out to represent the Arctic ice, and pull the sheets away, and they start finding themselves in less and less land. And we'll have we've got some other very clever ideas. We may have some, I don't want to give anything away, but we may have some flash mobs and guerrilla theater events in the park as well, which would be pretty fun if you're there to see what's happening and learn about climate change.
Now, interesting, we talked a little bit off air about my trips that I've taken. The Vietnam trip, what struck me there, in addition to the work that I was doing there, was the fact that on the street, and I spent a lot of time on the street in both in Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City, the vast amount of people that were wearing protective masks.
Wow.
Because the air quality there is so bad.
Really?
Yeah.
Really?
And you're talking a country of 90 million people. So both in Hanoi and in Ho Chi Minh City, I saw the same phenomenon. I'd see parents and kids walking all with their surgical masks on because of the poor air quality. Well, what do they use to fire up their plants? Coal. Yeah. Same thing they use in China.
Yeah, I knew that this was a very severe problem in Beijing in particular, in China, but I didn't realize it was also in Vietnam.
Same way in Vietnam. Yeah.
Wow.
And I noticed that when I ran there, that the air quality was not as good as it is back here. I mean, you can definitely tell the difference.
Hey, Felix, you know this, but by the coal power plants in this country, there's a great increased risk of emphysema, of lung cancer, of other diseases, and it's perhaps not surprising, but it's very racist the way in which it's usually in communities of color that these plants are built, or poor people. Yeah. They're the ones who are suffering the most. And what kind of pollution is going to be caused by a wind turbine or by a solar panel? Tell me, what do you want in your neighborhood? Do you want to have a coal power plant, for God's sake? Or do you want to have a solar panel? I mean, come on. It's not only about the future, it's about the kind of life we have to live today.
Yeah. One of the things that's, I think, most encouraging with regard to, even though the Trump administration is going in this wrong-headed and dangerous direction, and that threatens the Paris Agreement, and that's a very critical threat. But so far, the rest of the world is basically standing up and saying, okay, U.S., you can go that way, but we're not going to follow you. We're going to keep working on this. And China in particular is canceling all kinds of new coal-powered plants. And China is investing heavily in developing solar and wind energy. And so, again, I think you mentioned earlier, these other countries are going to become the economic leaders
at Germany.
In this area.
Look at Denmark. I mean, many European countries are already way ahead of us. Don't they generate something like 30% of their energy in Germany from renewable resources and so forth?
I mean, for the Chinese, for them, one of the side impacts of this is they see it in their faces all the time in places like Shanghai and Beijing because of the poor air quality. So they know. We've been, how should we say, blessed here, but willfully blind. But if we had to see that, what we saw, what you see in Los Angeles back in the 80s and 90s every day in most of our major cities, I think people would have a different attitude about it as well. But we've been able to mitigate some of that. But if we go back on these standards, you're going to see more and more of that coming again, where the cities are going to have foul air that's going to be, just a natural occurrence of producing these nasty fossil fuels.
That's well said, Felix.
Yeah, we do have just a couple of minutes left now, but Allan, one of the other things that I know that you're doing on campus is that there's a new campus organization called Change.
Right.
The students are getting mobilized to focus on this issue as well. Can you talk just a little bit about Change?
Well, I think that those of us professors who teach topics related to climate change, as I've started to do, find that our students are very concerned. And, this is the world they're going to live in. And they've decided they would like to start doing something about it, And so a group of students in my class formed what they call RSO, a registered student organization, that's called Change. They took the name from climate change and making a change. And so they've been meeting every week, and they're eager to have other students and even community members attend their events. And they put on a fantastic, working with some faculty, they put on a fantastic teach-in on climate change last week. We had 75 students came, and They combined presentations of students' knowledge and experience with faculty. It was a beautiful educational event, exactly what I think a real university, any kind of educational institution should look like. I used to teach in high school, and I think it's just the sort of thing that constitutes real learning, you know? And sometimes the students have to lead us. Sometimes the young people have to show us where we need to go. And I found at Western, I've loved working with young people there, and I found that I have a lot to learn by listening to them and supporting what they want to accomplish.
They did a great job that night.
You were there.
I was there.
You were one of the speakers, in fact.
I was one of the speakers at the
Yeah.
teach-in, but it was so nice to have that combination of faculty members presenting and then students presenting. And I think Dave and I, of course, being professors, we tried to present a little bit more in terms of the scholarly literature and the factual information, the scientific part of it. But what the students were providing was the emotional connection, that this was something that was really dramatically important to them because it was their future, and that emotional power, I think, was really great in the room.
They had
that
good
night.
stories. I mean, Nick, a Native American student actually, who had been to Australia, talked about the desertification he saw there, and he was talking about what's happening to the Great Barrier Reef. You know, I mean, they can see in their own lives, even in their own, from my perspective, young and shorter lives, they can see the world changing, and that is a wake-up call.
Allan, we just about have a minute left. If somebody wants to get involved with Earth Day, is there a way for them to do that?
You bet. Of course, we're on Facebook, Kalamazoo Earth Day. It'd be great to have you like the Facebook page and follow it. We'd love to have you get involved. We're looking for volunteers on the day of the event. We're looking for people who would like to have a booth at Earth Day, and that can be a nonprofit or a commercial booth. They're inexpensive. I think it's $50 for a company and $25 for a nonprofit, and we'll give you a table and chairs. And then we're looking for sponsors to get their logo on our T-shirt and really help support to make this happen. Anyone who would like to get involved, contact me. My email is allen.webb@wmich.edu. And of course, you can look Allan Webb up in Google in a moment, and you'll find me. So get involved and let me know how you'd like to be part of it.
So Earth Day, Bronson Park, April 22nd. Come on down. If you get to Washington on April 29th for the climate mobilization, that'll be great. Thank you, gentlemen, for being with us. Felix, good to see you again. Allan, thanks for being on the program.
Thank you,
Great
Ron.
to have you.
Thanks for having this program.
And we thank you for coming to visit us on Critical Issues, and we invite you to come back for another edition of Critical Issues, Alternative Views.